Okay, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started. I'm sure some people will still be joining us from other things. So my name's Ruth Lewis. I'm stepping in for Lawrence, who unfortunately isn't able to join us today. I'm really delighted to offer a warm welcome to Dr. Emily Warren, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Emily is an expert in schools-based research and evaluation of complex interventions. And she's here visiting our team for the NIHR-funded evaluation of Equally Safe at School in Scotland that Kirsty is leading to share her insights and expertise with us. Some of us were very fortunate to see Emily give a plenary talk at the recent Future of Evaluation in Health and Social Care Conference in Northumbria University, and we were really keen that Emily come and share that talk with others here in the school. So Emily's going to talk for about 40 minutes and then there'll be time for questions at the end. Can I just check, can everyone online hear us?
We get a thumbs up or something?
Yep, fine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Microphone in the room, not terribly clear.
Yes. Better. Oh, wait. There's a secret button. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. Like Ruth said, my name is Emily Warren. I'm from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'll be talking today about the possibility of conducting realist randomized controlled trials. So to begin, I just sort of wanted to go over the basic structure of a trial because the work that I'm presenting today ended up being quite controversial. It was part of about a 10-year debate about whether or not realist RCTs made any philosophical sense and whether or not they were practically feasible. One of the things that this debate showed is that even within the public health community, we don't actually have a shared understanding of what something like an RCT is. This isn't meant to be patronizing, it's just so that we have a common language to build from. So, in its simplest terms, or its simplest form, an RCT aims to test hypotheses about cause and effect by randomly allocating a sufficient number of either individuals or groups like schools or towns to receive an intervention or not, following them up for an amount of time that is appropriate based on whatever you're interested in, and then assessing differences at the end. So the reason that we use random allocation is for two primary benefits. The first is that it minimizes allocation bias, and secondly, it tends to minimize the differences between the two groups and their potential confounders. So while some confounders will be known in advance, others will not be known in advance, and this ensures that the groups have not exact evenness, but approximate evenness. And this balance also allows you to test for the impact of moderators later on. So control is also controversial and not necessarily understood. It just serves as a contemporaneous counterfactual. So what happens in the absence of the intervention? I want to be clear, this came up in the debate quite a bit. Having a control arm does not mean that researchers have any control. You still can't get participants to act in a way that you would like. It's not that level of control. It doesn't sanitize the world. It doesn't treat the world like a laboratory, or it's not that. It just means you have a comparator. It's a lot simpler than it seems. So trials are always, although I don't want to say always, accompanied by a process evaluation. These can be as simple as looking at whether or not participants enjoyed being in the trial, whether it's acceptable, or it can be a hugely complex affair with qual, quant, and mixed methods analyses built into it. So on the other side, you have realist evaluation. Now, realist evaluation was developed in opposition to experimental evaluations. There was a very real and important frustration with the fact that when effective, in quote, trials were replicated, the results were often not the same. So why wasn't this an effective intervention working in different places? So realist evaluation understands interventions as resources. Resources are introduced into contexts. They change someone's reasoning and their ability to behave differently. And then this will trigger social or psychological mechanisms, which will change outcomes. And how those outcomes change will be constrained by the context that they're in. So an intervention doesn't work. An intervention works in a context and will produce different results based on the environment of its implementation. And that sort of instinctively makes sense if you think about it. So the analysis is generally organized as a context mechanism outcome configuration. And this enables you to always be thinking about what works for whom, under what conditions, and how. And that is the thing that you need to remember about realism. That's the guiding sentence. What works for whom, under what conditions, and how. So it very much forefronts context and it forefronts mechanisms in a way that trials have not always sufficiently engaged with. So realist evaluation is based on critical realism, which was developed by Roy Basker in the 1970s. And it has 3 interconnected beliefs that underpin its ontology. So the first, which is represented by the barrel, is that reality exists and is independent of human knowledge. So, for example, coronavirus existed before anyone got sick. It was in the world, even though we hadn't heard of it yet. And the barrel can be anything. It can be abuse, it can be a bacteria, it can be anything. That's just what exists. The second is represented by the 2 scientists on the side. And that is that knowledge is always incomplete, it's perspectival, it's dependent on where you are in time and history, and it depends on how you look at the problem. And in realist terms, that's called epistemic relativism. Now, the third position, the scientist in the middle, is that it's possible to rationally adjudicate between competing claims because the barrel, or whatever the phenomena is that you're studying, is real, it's intransitive, but our knowledge of it changes over time. Our methods change, our methods developed. We can eventually gain a better understanding of what the phenomena is that we're studying. So I don't know if you remember, but like when COVID was just starting, there was a big concern because it seemed like only men were dying. And then within a few days, you're like, no, it's not men that are dying, it's smokers. And so that's an example of real-time adjudication. It could also be, is the Earth the center of the universe? No, it's the sun. And that's a much longer process of adjudicating what's actually happening. Then within a realist ontology, reality is actually stratified into 3 depths or 3 realms. So the first, the most superficial level at the surface is the empirical. That's the realm of our experiences. Beneath that is the realm of the actual. And this is where events and interactions happen, regardless of whether or not we know about them. And below that is this I kind of imagine it as being slimy, this messy, slimy world where there's mechanisms that may be active, they may be latent, there's potential. That's the realm of mechanisms. So we collect data to understand what's happening in the actual realm, and we use theory to sort of guide our evaluations to understand what's happening in the realm of the real. All right. So getting into the trial that we did, and trying to sort of actualize all of this. This was an intervention that was aiming to reduce bullying and aggression in secondary schools in England. And I'm not going to go through the details, but basically we had a mid-range theory. It was about how do we engage students in both the instructional, so like the curricular order of schools, and also in like the social processes and the rules and the policies, and how do we get students to engage in school that would ultimately improve their health. We had a mid-range theory. And all we did was provide schools with resources within a realist sense. So they got a manual, they got 2 sets of training, they got a social and emotional curriculum, they got survey data, and they got an external facilitator who served as like a critical friend for the first 2 years of the study. And those resources which are in the first column, were meant to implement processes. And the processes were meant to activate the social and psychological mechanisms that we derived about the curricular and the regulatory order in schools. That was meant to improve impacts and ultimately impact on our primary and secondary outcomes, which we were measuring at the end of the trial. So you don't need to know the details of this, but just to sort of walk you through how we built on mid-range theory to develop a logic model. So our question was, can we combine the rigor of an RCT with the depth of analysis it's necessitated by a realist ontology? So if we could, we would be able to examine the impact of different intervention components independently and collectively. We'd be able to explore fidelity of form and function, and we'd be able to understand the role of context on the activation of mechanisms. So when we published this paper, it started a 10-year, somewhat still ongoing debate. And the main concerns that kept coming up in the literature was that philosophically, RCTs are positivist, they're successionist. You cannot have an RCT that has a realist ontology. Also, there are practical concerns. Randomization and control stifle your ability to understand how change happens. You will only be able to test the most banal, boring, and useless CMOs, and you will not be able to understand mechanisms. So, people didn't like it. So what we did was we did the trial, we did the best we could, and then we tried to do some analyses which were realist and some that were not. So we published the paper, and what we found was that this intervention that we had carried out for 3 years, it did reduce bullying, smoking, alcohol, drugs, contact with the police, and it reduced psychosocial problems. It improved mental well-being, quality of life, and belonging in school. Our theory of change and our mid-range theories made us predict that it would be more beneficial from students with lower socioeconomic status. That hypothesis was wrong. That wasn't true. And like most other bullying interventions, it worked better for boys and those with previous experience of bullying, and less well for girls and those who had not been involved. So this was published in the Lancet. This was seen as like a good paper for an RCT. But none of this is realist. It's not configured as CMOs. It's not about mechanisms. It doesn't engage with how context affected these things. I still think this is useful analysis, but it's not realist, and I'm not going to pretend like it is. So with realism, we needed to sort of step back a bit. So the first step that we did was, before we could get into mechanisms, we wanted to see how implementation varied by context, because we knew that some schools just couldn't carry out an intervention that was this complex. So in this analysis, we found that the action group that was responsible for overseeing the intervention in the school was the best kind of lens to use, because they oversaw implementation and nobody had actually really studied the impacts of action groups before. So when we did this analysis, we found that action groups could be a really powerful motor for change when the leader was on the senior leadership team at the school and when they were really dedicated to the ethos of the study. We learned that the intervention was only seeming to work when the same staff appeared at these action group meetings over and over and over again. Like, students needed to see that these 5 teachers cared. If it was one teacher dropping in and out, you're not going to feel like anyone's investing in you. The intervention was not delivered well in some of our schools where the staff felt unsafe and where they were unwilling to sort of equal power dynamics. And the curriculum overall, although not everywhere, was delivered quite poorly. So this helped us refine our thinking about how context affects implementation. And obviously, if you're not implementing anything, it can't activate any mechanisms. So for us, this was an important first step. So the next paper that we wrote, we wanted to look at how participants were describing the process of their school changing, potentially as a result of this intervention. So this was sort of us opening like the black box of what is actually happening, how are schools using these resources, and what is actually changing. So to do this, I used a variant of grounded theory called dimensional analysis, which looks at, the words are slightly different, but they mean basically the same thing, of conditions, contexts, processes, mechanisms, and consequences, which are outcomes. So it aligns really well with realism, but the language is different. So we identified 3 key mechanisms, which are each themselves comprised of smaller ones. So these included increasing students' commitment to school, and that was done by learning each other's perspectives, including teachers and other students, improving relationships, increasing engagement in whole school activities. There was building healthy relationships, and this was particularly important in schools where the students had sort of below average pro-social skills at the beginning, and they needed to see and have demonstrated to them how to have a respectful dialogue, or like how to have a challenging dialogue that was still kind. And some of these students hadn't had experience with that before, so that was really important. And the final thing was more centered on the students who were deeply engaged in bullying. And this was, how do you de-escalate that? And how can you teach empathy? How do you teach people to accept responsibility for their actions? And how do you get them to accept that punishment is actually fair? So this bottom mechanism, with the empathy, forgiveness, acceptance of punishment, we didn't think about that at the beginning. That wasn't a hypothesis. That just came from the qualitative data. So you don't need to know the details, but these are the 3 key mechanisms and the sub-mechanisms that I just mentioned. And this is whether or not bullying decreased and whether or not mental health improved. So the first school was one of the most challenging schools. We only had 1 teacher who showed up to every action group meeting, constant firefighting, really complex unmet social needs in a highly deprived neighborhood. Like, the students had even asked us like if they could set the school on fire. Like, they hated their school. The staff were burnt out. The students, like, it was a very, very difficult context. And there's only 2 dedicated teachers who could focus on this restorative practice element. And those are the only mechanisms that they were able to activate, and nothing changed at a school level. There's just too much going on. And at the other end, you have a really, really rich school in a beautiful leafy suburb. And they also didn't have any positive impacts because they didn't really have any problems to begin with. So not a lot changed. In the middle, we had my favorite school in the trial. It was also a very deprived school, but they had such a dedicated pastoral care team, and they cared so much about the intervention that they activated, or there's qualitative evidence indicating that they activated every single one of the hypothesized mechanisms. And they actually had the biggest benefit out of all 20 schools in the intervention arm. So they really were able to like run with this intervention. Sorry, getting behind. So that paper gave us a lot of mechanisms that we could test, and we did that in 2 ways. The first one was a moderated mediation analysis. I don't know people's backgrounds here. Can you just raise your hand real quick if you've heard of moderated mediation analysis? Okay, so I didn't do this analysis. I didn't lead on this. I'm a qualitative person, but in short, moderated mediation analyses enables you to look at certain contexts. So you have all the schools. In schools with these certain contextual features, that's the moderator, do certain mechanisms, the mediator, do they lead to certain outcomes? So you're looking at a very small subset. So our question was, does a student's sense of belonging act as a mechanism at midline in schools, in the context, where they have outstanding leadership, below average levels of victimization, and above average levels of being an inclusive school? So you can see that's quite a select number of schools, but is belonging a mechanism there? And we found that it was, but only in those schools. Other schools still benefited, but they would have benefited because of a different mechanism activating. So for us, that was a really important finding, because it really did show that the context affects the activation of a mechanism. The other way that we tested this is through qualitative comparative analysis. So can you raise your hand if you've heard of QCA? Okay. Every time I ask, like more people have. So if you don't know, QCA is a method or an approach that's meant to reveal the pathway, sometimes called like the recipe to effectiveness or ineffectiveness. It's normally used with small sample sizes, but it's seen by realists as compatible with their ontology, so we used it. But I want to be clear, because some people get too excited about it, it is not without its disadvantages. So because you're dealing with small sample sizes, random error, which will happen, makes coincidental patterns appear causal, and there's absolutely no way that you can account for confounding. So I'm not saying don't use it, but just like don't go into it like too gung-ho and think that there's no problems with it. So what we found is that schools didn't need to activate all, or in fact even many mechanisms in order to generate a benefit. And that for me, what was the most exciting finding in the PhD was that control schools also activated the same mechanisms, but via different resources. And so that's sort of what we expected, because teachers want to take bullying seriously. They want to improve their students' mental health. They didn't have these set of resources, but they were still doing something. But what they also showed is that they reduced bullying less, and they reduced bullying via fewer mechanisms. So there was still an added benefit of having the learning together intervention in their school. So going back to the concerns of why realist realist trials are bad in this debate. So as I said earlier, realism is really just the belief that reality exists, is independent of human knowledge, that we can know about it and we can adjudicate it. Nothing about trials is oppositional to that. Like there's a paper published calling the idea oxymoronic. It's not. You can have a trial and still believe all of these things. The difference is you can then make your comparisons that aren't biased and don't have confounding. So that's the benefit of doing the trial, not just using natural experiments. The thing I still hear all the time is that trials are positivist. Like I heard this 2 days ago. You hear this all the time. Trials are positive, trials are bad, trials are positivist. So we took this concern really seriously, because it's one of those words that you use it to insult statisticians and economists, but I don't think that's necessarily fair. So we looked and we did a lit review and said, like, well, what is positivism and what are we apparently doing wrong? So this lit review showed us that the key tenets of positivism are that knowledge is derived from direct sensory observation, theoretical terms must equate with empirical measurements, the goal is to generate universally applicable laws, and that the same methods are used in natural and social sciences. That's all positivism is. So we looked at our own trial, and we said, no, at least with inclusive, our trial was hypothetico-deductive. It was based on our mid-range theory that I shared with you earlier on. Theoretical terms equating with empirical measurements, you could do, but most are now based on a mid-range theory. Are we trying to generate universal laws? No, we're trying to obviously create something that's generalizable and transferable, but we would never say this intervention will work this well in all schools in all contexts. That's kind of a silly thing to think anyway. The social and the natural sciences. If you're doing a thing on how to develop drought-resistant rice, you're not like sitting there talking to the rice plants, asking how they feel, if they feel it's acceptable. Like we're using hermeneutical traditions, we're using interviews, focus groups, observations, participatory methods. We don't need to use the same methods, and that's fine. And the final critique that came up over and over and over again was that trials are successionist. And successionism just means that you believe in constant conjunctions, that an outcome will always follow the same cause. And this is a sort of an attack that's used on any type of statistics in a lot of realist circles. And we do use statistics, but that doesn't mean that we're being successionist. We're trying to create, transferable understanding but we're not saying that something always happens after the other. So that's why we did the moderated mediation analysis. That's why we did the QCA, to break down what it is in the context that means outcomes will generally follow that pattern. But we're not saying something is always true. So in terms of the practical concerns, which I think are more important in some ways, because you can debate the philosophy till you're blue in the face, but in terms of the practical concerns, as I said, we were told that randomization and control stifle our ability to understand how change happens. I would argue that randomization allowed for the fair comparisons across the different arms, and that the control group was actually way more useful than I had understood at the beginning, because it gave us a comparable population to test our theories on that isn't affected by secular trends, maturation, regression to the mean. It was as balanced a comparison as you will ever find in the world. We were told that we would never be able to test CMOs, but the methods that a realist evaluator would use to test their CMOs are qualitative data, and you can gather that in a trial. So that wasn't a problem. And then, like I said, we tested them using moderation, mediation, moderated mediation, and QCA. And there could have been more. You could have used growth mixture modeling. I'm sure statisticians could come up with a lot more methods that I haven't heard of that we could have used, but we just, didn't. And finally, we were able to assess mechanisms by using grounded theory and then by testing them again. So the concerns didn't actually materialize in the way that we were warned that they would. So are realist trials possible and useful? We found that they were. We could build from, test, and importantly refine our mid-range theory. We were able to unpick patterns with a lot more nuance about why an intervention worked. We were also able, I didn't get into this, but we were also able to study where the intervention might be least beneficial or potentially harmful, and advise on which schools maybe shouldn't use an intervention that this intensive. And it helps us to understand and to apply our future learning to other trials through the better use of theory. Now, one of the things that I did want to emphasize is that there seems to be a belief among realist evaluators that there's an ownership feeling about the idea of context and mechanisms, but you can do research on these topics being a realist, and you can generate findings that should be of interest to realists, even if you don't label your study a realist evaluation, realist informed, realist inspired, whatever. Lots of them, I'd say the most common question I get from people doing RCTs is, well, am I a realist? Because I look at mechanisms, I look at context. I don't think you need to use the label realist to do these interesting pieces of work. So just to sort of flag that as an issue. Thank you very much. We do have a textbook available. It's based on this, I've done this PhD. And then if you want, I have citations, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much for listening. I'll let you.
I'm just going to stand up in case there are questions from people online as well. But does anyone in the room question? Right.
Emily Taylor, that was brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. So just a bit of context, I am a statistician and I do trials often in a complex intervention setting.
Yeah.
So I think the first observation is you completely changed. So there are a number of statisticians in the room who are card-carrying statisticians, and I don't think many of us would claim that we can do some of the things that you do very nicely. And I'm learning because I'm working with Kirsten on the ESAS trial where we're going to be implementing.
Oh yeah, that's why I'm here actually.
Of your methods like moderated mediation. So every day's school day continues to be. So I guess my couple of just observations, and I just want to check I'm kind of understanding right. So if we come to apply these methods to ESAS, I've got it.
Yeah.
So very comfortable that when we do trials, we can pre-specify a logic model. Indeed, we often do as part of the protocol, we'll publish our logic model. I think one of the things that you've shown us is that if you're doing prospective qual work during the trial, you can revisit your logic model and update your understanding of what might be mediators and moderators. Is that right?
So
You're kind of you're kind of doing like a post hoc definition of some of the things that you're actually observing in real time at the trial, rather than everything being pre-specified at the front, which we would often try and do.
So we were doing the qualitative analysis after we knew the results, most of it. So I think there's a difference. One thing I was always taught that you need to be very clear in your protocol, and when you come to your final reporting, you need to report your per protocol analyses. But I would argue that there's a real risk of losing richness if you stop there. So that you can add other analyses, you can write other papers, because that's where a lot of our most important findings were, because I would argue that you need to do the qualitative work to inform some of the later quantitative analyses. They both have a role, and I think you need to report accurately and do the analyses you're going to say, but there is a lot of value in letting the qualitative work guide future analyses. But then also you need to be clear and say this was post hoc. Or in some of like our QCA, not our QCA, in some of our papers, we lost the benefit of randomization. We had to be clear about that because we don't want to misrepresent what we've done.
That's really helpful. So again, I think we're grappling with statistical analysis plan, and we are actually saying things like moderators and mediators. Some of these will be data defined once the core work's been done, and you're kind of saying that's okay.
Well, but just saying, so we did have pre-specified moderators, so like boys and girls.
Yeah, and we have done that too.
Yeah, so we tested those, but then we also added more moderators and mediators later.
Yeah. Yeah.
Over here, but online can see it.
Is that I think what we're saying is that clinical trial has got the benefits that we can have this causal analysis, causal randomization, but it's also it's an observational model where we can bring together two groups, intervention and control, and regard them observationally to help us understand not just does the intervention work, but how does it work. And I think we're all into that. So what I'm really trying to do, I guess, is basically just agree we're maximizing the learning we get from a trial without just shading a sort of classic statistical lens. We're really doing that through. And I think we should really be encouraging investigators. And I'm thinking when we're sitting on committees, when you see trials coming through when they're not doing this kind of stuff that it could be, we're kind of losing value for money. So I think what you're really saying is incredibly important in maximizing our knowledge around trials going forward. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also, it's easy to stop when the analysis is done. And like we failed at this, and I'm going to put my hands up. We didn't go back and write another paper refining the mid-range theory that we based it on. And we absolutely could have, and maybe we absolutely should, but we haven't yet. But that's another way to ensure that the science moves forward, is by refining the theory as well. Because I think that's the area that often gets underappreciated, is why theory is so important, is it guides your analysis. It's a lovely map to have.
Hi, just a second on your comment, no question. So just thinking about like announcement I'm involved in. Who lead this large man's trials in Chicago funded, but they basically didn't want to from process point, which is more than what is different because I think it's pretty clear that what has happened for many years and continues to happen is that we develop these amazing interventions, we deliver them in a trial and find them effective, we roll out and practice seem to work. and reasoning will work, but we don't know because we never collected the data to explore that. So I think that just kind of reflecting on what Laura said, it's just so important that how do we kind of convince others of the importance of this kind of work, because there's no point in saying doing a trial, we've got really understanding of how the intervention works, knowing how it works and what
Also, in that case, you can't even really identify if it's like type 1, 2, or 3 error, like if something as basic as that.
100% agree. And then the three of us, we've all been involved in a trial that we would call a realist trial, and we've just published the main outcome paper. And it's so interesting because one of our 4 NIHR outputs is that the process evaluation was always a realist process evaluation. And that's the one we've really struggled to get published. What's been really interesting is we didn't get into the Lancet. And one of the reasons I think we didn't get into the Lancet was because it's very complex. We did get into Nature Medicine, and they have they're much less procedural in the way that you report it. And actually for us, it's actually one of the quantitative process findings we think is the most important finding of the trial. It was a negative trial, but the realist process evaluation, quant and qual, I think has really helped us understand the system and been able to really help us argue with policymakers. This is why it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so I would totally agree, and I think we need to be moving forward to actually reporting some of the realist findings in the main outcome, because otherwise you're not learning as much as you can be learning.
In our process evaluation, I think we had like, in our main outcome paper, I think we had 2 or 3 paragraphs on the process evaluation, and it didn't mention a word of realism. But that's, those are all separate publications that were done later.
Got a question online, and then we'll come to you, Kirsty. So there's a question from Jenna, right? What about in the earlier stages of intervention and trial development, so feasibility and pilot stages? Does this approach work better? It's more robust once you have a control group for the full trial.
So first of all, not a silly question at all. So obviously, if you're doing a feasibility or pilot study, you wouldn't have the outcome measures to test, but you could still absolutely incorporate realist principles into understanding why some schools are better able to deliver the intervention or not, and what mechanisms might be occurring. You wouldn't obviously test them, they wouldn't have power. There'll be limits because of the sample size, but you can, and I would argue should, incorporate some of these principles of looking at mechanisms and context through all stages of evaluation. Not because I'm like a diehard realist who thinks that that's what the process should be. I just think that it's such a valuable approach to always honing in on your research. I just think it's a useful way to focus on the more nuanced questions of evaluation that we should be asking. And thank you for your question.
Kirsty?
Those are great talk. So I've got an issue in my head, and I hope I can articulate it.
Okay.
It's a bit about the timing of learning.
Yeah.
And the learning about the mechanisms and the context, and whether it's exploratory versus sort of confirmatory. So I had a question which you actually already answered, which was when did you do this? And you already said you did this when you knew that the trial had worked. So in a sense, you're looking for explaining why was this effective, so the mechanisms of effectiveness.
Yeah.
What if the trial had a null result? Is there work that you could, is there useful work that you can still do in this space? And is it around understanding why the trial didn't work, or understanding the mechanisms that are the mechanisms kind of universal? It's just that for these reasons they didn't kick in enough.
Yeah.
Or is it around, more kind of it didn't work, and this is why. So it's a little bit about how useful is this work for a trial with the
null finding.
The null findings. I mean, there's what you're saying, lots of useful learning, but what about other mechanisms? The mechanisms, it's just that they didn't kick in, or
Or are the
Or-
mechanisms being overridden by other contextual features?
Yeah.
So I think, I think that's a really important question, and I absolutely love that you have, and you might be publishing a paper with the null findings. I think that that's really important. I'm working on a separate study in Norway right now about movement, play, and exploration with preschool kids. And their pilot had a null finding, but one of my PhD students is doing this qualitative research, and she's finding all these mechanisms about how it worked. I was like, but it didn't work. And so I think it's really interesting, and I think it's a difficult problem, but I kind of wonder when we say the intervention didn't work. It didn't work at the trial level, but did it actually work in certain schools? So I would want to go back, never been a PI, but if I were, I would maybe ask the statisticians that I work with to go back and see, with as much power as you can you tell me if it did work in these places? Because then that would still tell you a lot about what's happening and why it's happening there and not there. Because I do think that there's still learning to be had, especially because the results of a trial are the aggregate across all sites. So maybe it did work in quite a few places. And so that I think that merits deeper digging. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I guess,
I feel like I haven't.
but in the inclusive trial, how much do you think you were kind of influenced by the fact that you knew the trial had worked? Was that an absolutely overriding kind
No,
of
because when we started developing the analysis plan and when we started, we knew the results. So for the action group paper on fidelity, I don't think we knew. And I think if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, we learned halfway through the grounded theory paper. So it wasn't guided through all of it.
Okay,
It was sort of in the process that we learned. But I think because so many schools didn't like the trial, and we thought it wasn't going to work for most of it, we were quite surprised that we had any impact. I don't think it did impact much, and also my knowledge of statistics, especially at the beginning of my PhD, I mean, I still know nothing, but at the time was like this high. So even if you had told me the impact was not one, I wouldn't have known if that was big or small. I was so ignorant that don't really feel like it could have impacted me that much. I used to have to like sit next to our statistician and be like, Charles, what does that mean? And he'd have to tell me if it was like a good or a bad thing, because I'm so qualitative. So I don't think it had much of an impact, but like you wouldn't want to put that in a paper, for example, because obviously you know that it could have some impact. So again, I haven't helped you with your question.
No, it's really helpful. It is helpful. It's really helpful.
Sorry, did someone?
Yes, me.
Thank you.
So fantastic talk, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So there's a couple of economists in the room, I'm one of them. And I work on the economic evaluation for ESAS, but also I've worked with Helen on the economic evaluation of BEST, and so is my colleague Manuela over there. So just fantastic talk, and so interesting. And I think quite naturally a lot of economists working in complex public health evaluations are naturally gearing towards what they probably wouldn't call a realist economic evaluation. And there's a lot of really great guidance around that. So we're all kind of being a little bit more pragmatic. We want to deal with this more on the outcome side with regards to developing, for example, cost consequence analysis type frameworks, which are a little bit more helpful for when you haven't got that primary outcome of significance. But I just think for today, so Emily, what would you say to the economists? What advice would you give us to be more realistic in our economic evaluation?
And I said, go on, Chris. So hands up. I know nothing about statistics. I know even less about economics. But if you go back to the bare bones of realism of what works for whom under what conditions and how, that question, I would imagine, can still guide economic questions. And because there might be something like a different, I think you said cost consequence?
Yeah.
Analysis for students with different backgrounds, or for students, in this case, maybe, looking at, is it like a connection to moderators that could be made of like, is the value, does the intervention hold different values for students? How could, I'm spitballing because I don't know anything about economics. Could you look at how an intervention could be optimized to improve health equities based on some questions? Because, yeah, I'm wondering if the health and equities lens based on the cost of a consequence of the cost of a benefit might be different. I don't know anything, but I think, yeah, something.
I do understand. I think there's some realist economic evaluation advice.
I'm sure there is lots of guidance. I just am not the right person to ask about it.
Great. We'll hook up with Angela, I think.
Yeah,
Really helpful.
it's not, but thank you for being so polite. It's not helpful, but I appreciate your kindness.
Please, I just wanted to ask a question as well. So sort of spinning off that question, do you have any advice? It's that question that people always ask at the beginning of advisors, sort of looking
Oh,
back
yeah.
or be there. Do you have any advice for teams that are considering this kind of approach about the sequence in which things should be done or where the analytic effort should be invested?
So I think for me, the section of papers that had the most value was doing the grounded theory is really difficult. It's really time consuming. Doing the grounded theory work for me was, I think, amongst the most rewarding, because you did get to see with the deepest level of granularity what was actually changing and how. And then I think to go forward and test that is, again, it feels quite rewarding, because it does feel like you're solving a mystery of how something worked. And when you spent years developing or working in an intervention, to say like, I actually get it, I think that feels really nice. And then it's a nice finding to report, because then you can say, you know, in schools that tend to be positive or that tend to be this intervention could be really beneficial. But if you're a school that's struggling with perhaps like an authoritarian or like quite a militant ethos, maybe to get these benefits, you actually need to start smaller and start with just like the restorative practice component to minimize harms and to maximize benefits. I think being able to report to schools or to, in this case, like to funders or publications, that sort of enables you to say where it should be used. And that's quite useful, because then it feels like you actually might be helping someone. I think the hardest step, and the step that I've never had to take, and I don't fully understand how it can be done well, is picking the mid-range theory, because it's not often clear. They're often not ready-made. Chris, who is my PhD supervisor, he really relies heavily on this theory for health promoting schools, and now he's written role theory. But like, if you don't have that already, it can be really hard to identify, and sometimes you have to build theory ladders about like, you know, in terms of behavior change, it might be this, but at a social level, it might be this. And I think that's really hard, is to find or to build the theory that you're basing everything on. That to me it's just indescribably difficult. Important, but really hard. Yeah.
What's that? For the last 10 years. So I just wanted to ask you to sort of go back to the feasibility stage. So just thinking about some of the stuff you presented, which is really interesting, and thinking that sometimes when we've done trials, we go, oh shit, what do we measure that? We've done a mutation analysis. So I just wanted to kind of comment on sort of, because obviously feasibility studies will look for your program and optimization trial. I suppose if you had any reflections on how far to go down that line of feasibility trials, I suppose to help minimize the chances that you might not be measuring something that's really key.
First of all, I don't think I've ever met a researcher who's got to the end of the trial and be like, oh, I'm so glad we measured everything. Like, you always find something. And that's, I think, again, part of the value of the qualitative research, is it tells you what else you could look for. And I think that's in the discussion section, you say, you know, future evaluations of this should consider whether or not this was a mechanism. And So to full disclosure, I was not part of the feasibility study. I joined this trial later on after it had already begun being implemented. So I can't speak directly to that, but I think maybe the weaker answer is maybe give yourself some grace that you will never find every answer. No trial can answer every question. And the best you can do is your best at the time. And I think that's all we can do as people. It's not a scientific answer, but you will never find, your survey would just be incalculably long if you incorporated everything. If you do find something, in the first year of your trial, you could always try and slip it into the midline data collection, or even at the end line, but then you can say, I'm not sure if this is a mechanism or an outcome, because you don't know which emerged first. So you can do that if there's one thing where you're like, oh, that is actually a big deal. You can slip it in later. But I think that's kind of the best you can do. Any other questions online?
Any other questions? Yeah, I was just going to say, any questions in the room or online?
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for coming.